In Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament, chapter 7 and also in chapter 44, we see reference to the Queen of Heaven. So in verse 17 of chapter 44, it says, "But we will do everything that we have vowed, burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and pour out libations to her as we did, both we and our fathers, our kings and our princes, in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of food and prospered and saw no evil." Now, the inference here is that because they offered these sacrifices of libations and food, etc., that this so-called Queen of Heaven, this false goddess, that she sort of kept them well provisioned with food, and because they did these things, that she protected them. So the context here is that the Queen of Heaven is a false god. So one of the many different false gods that were worshipped by the various tribes and peoples in that area when the Israelites were moving into the land of Israel. So the point that the caller was trying to make was he was trying to equate the Queen of Heaven, this false goddess in the Old Testament, Jeremiah, trying to equate her with the Catholic understanding of Mary as the Queen of Heaven, because we use the same term. Now, I've gone down this road before and explained it before, but because maybe some people listening right now may not have heard it before, just remember, first of all, there is a logical fallacy at work here, that because something is mentioned in one context in one way, that therefore, if it's mentioned in a different context in a different way, that it's the same thing. And that's not true. So, for example, the idea that Jesus is God, we call him God, but yet there were many false gods in the Old Testament who were referred to as gods. Even the judges of Israel were referred to as gods, small g. So very different context, very different meaning. There were other instances in which you've got things like the Christmas tree, for example. The Christmas tree, which is something that Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, reject because they look back in the Old Testament and they see, wait a minute, there were some pagans who were decorating trees. So they had these big evergreen trees and they were putting who knows what on it, tinsel and baubles and whatever things that they were beautifying those trees with. Therefore, Jehovah's Witnesses, again, falling into the same fallacy that Scott falls into, they said, well, oh, look, because there's an example of a Christmas tree in the Old Testament, or a tree that resembles what we think of as a Christmas tree. Therefore, we shouldn't do that because that's pagan. Nonsense. Because when you have a Christmas tree, you're celebrating the birth of Jesus. It has nothing to do with paganism. Same thing, different context. There are many such examples. Another example would be birthdays. Would be another example of, although Scott did not fall into this particular fallacy, the fallacy that he continually falls into is the same as the Jehovah's Witnesses also, who say we don't celebrate birthdays. Well, why not? Because look, in the Bible, when you see a birthday being celebrated, something really bad happens, like in the case of John the Baptist. It was Herod's birthday, after all, and his birthday celebration involved this beautiful dancing girl asking him for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And so we're not going to celebrate birthdays now because look what the bad thing that happened to St. John the Baptist on Herod's birthday. They have no connection with each other. That's why they don't celebrate Christmas, because it's the birthday of Jesus. That's why they don't celebrate their birthdays. That's why they won't celebrate your birthday. So my point is, whether it's the Christmas tree or birthdays or the title Queen of Heaven or something like that, it's a mistake to say because pagans did this long ago, therefore if you do it today, you're essentially you're involved in paganism. Another example. I mean, there are so many examples. We could spend the next hour talking about this. The days of the week: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Those are named, for the most part, after pagan gods. Thor's Day. We get the word Thursday from the Old German, and Thor was one of those Germanic gods that were worshipped, and we still today use the same word, Thursday, derived from Thor's Day, and we don't mean anything pagan by it. Is your birthday in March? Well, March is the English version of the Latin word in honor of the false god Mars, the god of war, so-called. And so whether it's the months of the year or the days of the week, If you use those things, you have no pagan intention whatsoever. There's no connection. In fact, you're probably surprised to even hear me say this, some of you. And it's the same kind of fallacy that Scott commits, where if you say, well, the pagans use this and they're talking about pagan gods, therefore if you use the same word, somehow you're talking about pagan gods. Not true. Simply not true. So when it comes to the idea of the Queen of Heaven, if we want to get really biblical about this, as I mentioned to Scott, we see in Revelation chapter 12, the woman clothed with the sun. And what is she wearing? A crown. Who are crowns for? Crowns are for royalty, for kings and queens. Shortly before that, in Revelation chapter 4, we're told that around the throne of Almighty God were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clad in white garments and golden crowns upon their head. And these elders, by the way, they bow down before the Lord, and they cast their crowns down before the Lord, singing hymns. So among the other promises that Jesus makes to us, including such things as, he tells the apostles, indeed, you will judge the angels. In Matthew 19, verse 28, Jesus says to them, truly I say to you, in the new world, he's referring to heaven, when the Son of Man shall sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So the point being is, everybody in heaven is a king and a queen. Everybody, those who are in heaven with God, the saints who are in heaven, perfected in righteousness, as it says in Hebrews chapter 12, they are kings and queens. Why? Because they are the adopted sons and daughters of the King of Kings. You see how this works? So if we Catholics, taking our cue from what we see in the Holy Bible and what has been taught continuously, even if in seed form, in seminal form in the early church, and we recognize, and rightly so, the royal quality of those who are in heaven, the greatest of whom is the Blessed Virgin Mary, and we identify her as a queen in heaven, as Jesus himself says, you're going to be sitting on thrones and you're going to be wearing crowns. It is a fallacy to then say, wait a minute. I'm doing my Jimmy Stewart impersonation by accident, by the way. But somebody were to say, but look, back in Jeremiah, it mentions somebody as the Queen of Heaven. Therefore, you need to ignore all of this New Testament information because I think that you are being pagan. So that's what that's all about.
For more of The Patrick Madrid Show, visit relevantradio.com/Patrick.